other colleagues later, and some colleagues join through online as well. We are living in wonderful time. We can join, enjoy some meetings, discussions remotely as well. It's one of the best side of the modern technology. And dear colleagues, I'm really pleased to welcome you to today's panel discussion on protecting information integrity in the age of artificial intelligence. And today's discussion will be related to UN's CSTD works in analyzing the impact of the rapid technological change on achievement of the sustainable development goals and negotiations related global digital compact. Also, the United Nations mostly focused, we are not just United Nations, but we are mostly focused on the positive aspect of the technological change, but we cannot afford ourselves to ignore associated risks or related risks. Especially in this time when it's launched of the ChatGPT and artificial intelligence tools more accessible to wider public and has given big chance to companies and companies start to massively or intense to invest more rising this technology. We all know very well every technology can be abused. Artificial technology is not exception. When it's used improperly, it can be quite dangerous, and it can divide countries. It can increase internal and external insecurity, undermine human rights, and so on. Unfortunately, it's not just individuals, but also governments are also trying abusing artificial intelligence. Governments also has their tools how to manipulate the information and enhance censorship, incite hatred, and justify military aggressions as well. Therefore, in order to ensure the technological change bring benefits to all, it's necessary to discuss those threats and more details, share our experience and public solutions as international efforts are needed to mitigate the risks associated with it. I extend my sincere appreciations for all of you and of course distinguished speakers. They will provide their perspective on how to maintain information integrity in the age of artificial intelligence, and once more, thanks to all of you finding time, such early morning, early time. I know it's late schedules in Geneva. It's very, very busy, and you have afterwards also very, very busy schedule. And before I give the floor to my colleague Viktor Makarov, special envoy on digital affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia, and to moderate today's discussions, I thank once more Secretariat of CSTD for making this side event possible. I thank you, all of you. I think, the panelists as well, once more, and let's open our discussions and enjoy today's discussions. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you, Bakhtios. And just to repeat, my name is Viktor Makaros. I work on digital issues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia. And we want today to do something that, so as far as I know, has not been that much in focus. There are three aspects, and each of them has been indeed discussed extensively in the UN and largely. But what we want to try to do today is actually triangulate. And here are three main concepts that we want to engage with today. One is disinformation and information integrity. The second one is artificial intelligence. And the third one is human rights. So, triangle, purposeful information manipulation, disinformation, in other words, conducted by malicious or unethical actors. It has been recognized globally as a threat to public safety and security and democratic stability of nations. So that's one concept. On top of that comes this very, I think, rapid new technological development, the maturity of artificial intelligence technologies, generative AI, large language models, which we all have heard of now because of ChatGPT, other similar technologies. These pose even more grave questions about the nature of the digital reality we live in. What we see vis-a-vis disinformation these days is that artificial intelligence provides algorithms for disinformation. It gives an opportunity for malicious actors to create more fakes and more volume, better quality fakes and more volume. And here is where the human rights aspects and freedom of expression come in. There is not just more dangerous disinformation, but it also engenders, shall we say, more radical attempts to use online censorship and surveillance to address real or presumed threats. And this is a danger, of course, to human rights and especially freedom of expression. Now, I'm a moderator, I'm not a speaker, so I should actually let other speakers engage with these topics. And the way we intend to do it today is I have three questions suggested for discussion. So we will take three quick rounds. We have two speakers with us in the room and three excellent speakers as well online. In the first round, I will also ask you to present what you do, your angle on disinformation, artificial intelligence, and human rights. So in the first round, I would be liberal enough to give you 4, maybe even 5 minutes if needed for the first question, but then we'll have to go quicker. And after these 3 rounds, we'll take questions from the room, but also online. I think we have tens of people joining us online. Thank you very much, online audience as well. So it's a strict schedule. We have 5 speakers now. I'll tell you quickly who the speakers are, and then we take the first one. So the first speaker will be Mr. Justin Aronstein, who is Chief Executive of the non-governmental organization Code for Africa. He's going to join us online. To the right of me is Ms. Aaron Jo, who is Deputy Director of the Digital Inclusion Lab, Center for International Digital Policy, Global Affairs Canada. Aaron, I hope you will tell us what the Digital Inclusion Lab is as well. Ms. Paulina Ibarra, who is Executive Director of Fundación Multitudes, is going to join us online. Also online, Mr. Jan Nicola Beyer, who is Digital Democracy Research Coordinator at Democracy Reporting International. And last but not least, Peggy Hicks, who is Director, Thematical Engagement, Special Procedures and Right to Development at the Office of the UNHCHR. So we will start with an online speaker because we want to mix a little bit. And I trust we have Justin Aronstein online ready to talk to us. And the first question I want to pose to the panel is this. What are the implications of the evolving AI capabilities in terms of the threat of disinformation and also in terms of the vision of an online public space that is open, free, but also safe and secure? What are the risks of AI? Who are the actors that could potentially use AI to inflict harm? But also, can AI help us? So this is a question I address to all 5 of you, but we start with you, Justin. Please go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Thanks very much. I trust everyone can hear me.
We
So-
can't hear you. Sorry.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for that introduction. So as you indicated, I'm with a non-profit watchdog that operates across 22 countries in Africa, where we monitor for and investigate coordinated disinformation and information warfare. And we've already seen AI being deployed at scale as a tool to push specific narratives or specific messages, or try and convince people of particular facts that are not necessarily true. We've seen this in everywhere from Burkina Faso to even countries such as the DRC, where there's limited internet access. So this is not just a problem of highly technological kind of societies. We already see AI being deployed into countries where there is limited online access. The dangers are that AI makes it incredibly cheap and easy and fast to deploy disinformation campaigns. So disinformation campaigns are campaigns where either disruptive or inflammatory messaging or information is spread, or alternatively, where completely false information is spread, but it is made to look like it is either perpetrated or kind of originated from credible and reliable sources. So in the case of Burkina Faso, it's just one example. We've seen a campaign using a very cheap $30 tool from the USA being used by a local Burkina politician to create the perception of a campaign of African-American supporters of this person's particular political agenda, and calling for support of a candidate in an election. In the DRC, we've seen similar campaigns in support of a rebel movement, undermining the credibility of UN peacekeepers. These are just two very kind of different examples of how AI can be deployed. In both those cases, the AI was used to create what looked like real people or avatars, creating videos, probably very much like kind of this disembodied face that you see on the video screen at the moment in the conference. And these were completely fictitious people. They do not exist. It's not even a photograph that has been reanimated. They are completely composed by an AI. So the danger is very real, even with the early versions of AI of generative AI that we see being available to the general public at the moment. But on the flip side of this, in the same way that it makes the ability to create false information easier, it also gives watchdogs like my organization tools to detect and to counteract this kind of harmful content. It gives us tools that are just as cheap and just as quick. So I would say that in the total sum of impacts, what we are seeing here is a speeding up of interventions or dangers in the information space, but also the ability to respond far quicker than what we have been able to in the past at a far lower cost. What we need to be thinking about is, how do we lay an ethical framework or guide rails that makes it possible for us to operate in this new space with some degree of confidence that when we are seeing content, we'll be able to determine what is generated or synthetic and what is real.
Thank you very much, Justin. We will come back to policies to address the threats of disinformation in the next round, but this has been really interesting. So cheap, easy, fast, it's not always good. It can mean more malicious disinformation. It can also help us detect it. So to me, sounds like an arms race. Now over to Canada. Erin, what's your perspective on what the threats of AI are presented by AI, and who does it help more?
Thanks, Victors. My name is Erin Zhu. I represent a digital inclusion lab at Global Affairs Canada. Our team's work focuses on the intersection of digital policy, digital technologies, and foreign policy. For us, digital inclusion rests on pillars such as digital literacy, connectivity, safety, and access. This would really allow for the meaningful access and participation of different people around the world, and allowing for civic engagement. And to add to what Justin had said in his intervention, it's a greater scale, speed, and increasing access to sophisticated tools that are more easily available and cheap. But as he mentioned, the same tools used to amplify disinformation can also be used to detect disinformation. Even though ChatGPT has made the issue much more well known to a general audience, these tools are not necessarily new. They've been used to proliferate disinformation for many years now. And there are many tools that we can also use to detect artificial activity, such as open source data analysis, natural language processing, and social network analysis. And what's important is to focus on the content, to focus on the structure and the context of the information being conveyed rather than the content. It helps understand what really signals artificial activity. Some of this work is done by Canada's Rapid Response Mechanism, which was initially a G7 initiative meant to help strengthen coordination in identifying and responding to threats to democracies, including foreign interference and information manipulation. So I also want to make the point that new technologies always offer both opportunities and harms. The same openness and anonymity that allows for greater meaningful participation online are also being weaponized by malicious actors. Just as they're constantly changing their tools and tactics, I think we have to remain flexible in our approach and adapt our strategies as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Erin. Still a positive message. And again, it's interesting news that we perceive ChatGPT as something new, but actually it isn't. And says something about where at least some of us perhaps have really missed the important developments. We now go back online. We'll have two speakers joining us remotely, and Paulina Ibarra, Executive Director of Fundación Multitudes, is the first one. Very good morning, Paulina, or still in the middle of the night. Thank you very much for joining us at this early or late hour. Please go ahead.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Victor, for the introductions and to the permanent mission of the Republic of Latvia to the United Nations office in Geneva for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. Fundación Multitudes is leading the Women's Observatory Against Disinformation, contributing to the prevention and fight against online gender violence generated by purposely information manipulation, aka disinformation, in the civic and political participation of women in the regional level, currently in Argentina, Honduras, Brazil, Peru, Chile, Mexico, and Colombia. As others already said, the evolving capabilities of AI have increased the discussion around its impact in the online public space scrutiny, fairness, and accountability, and particularly in light of recent viral usages of AI, such as the creation of content through ChatGPT, images through Midjourney, voice generation through Murphy, and others. For example, just a few days ago, Pope Francis went viral because of the dissemination of AI-generated pictures. These images were created using Midjourney and were successful in deceiving many millions of people through social media and being an example of information manipulation. Although in this particular case, AI was not used with the intention to be misleading, it is a case of misinformation, which is it's a previous step towards purposely manipulating information. Deep fake AI is a type of artificial intelligence used to create images, audio, and video with the intention of mislead. Deepfake transform existing source of content where one person is swapped for another, and they also create entirely new content where someone is represented doing or saying something they didn't do or say in reality. According to the ACE agency, 20% of the images generated by AI feature women as the main focus, and DAC Beechcroft, more than 90% of deepfake victims are women who are subject to online sexual harassment or abuse through non-consensual deepfake pornography. And please let's not go to forget the word deepfake was used for the first time by Reddit user who actually uploaded artificial face swap pornography of popular female celebrities in 2017. So although the fakes targeting politicians or political discourse make up less than 5% of those circulating online, this does not change the debate around how we should approach or regulate deepfakes online, considering their enormous ability to spread false information appearing to come from actually trusted sources. Another specific challenge for AI for an open, safe, free, and secure online public space that I would like to share with you this morning is the perpetuation of prejudice, which can be severe threat in policy making by fueling prejudicial policy. For example, a study by UNESCO, OECD, and IADB revealed last year that AI human resources systems reflected past bias data against women in the workplace, excuse me. Setting the user gender to female resulted in fewer instances of ads related to high-paying jobs than for users selecting male as a gender in a popular job site. Furthermore, indirect correlation to information integrity and content regulation in social media. In 2021, Black content creators denounced a popular video on social media platforms for flagging publications as inappropriate content just for including the word Black, which was a result of an inadequate use of an algorithm that flagged phrases typically associated with hate speech without considering word order. So in the world, when we talk about positives and negatives, unfortunately, in the world of women, girls, underrepresented communities, AI is definitely causing more damage than helping. Thank you, Victor.
Oh, thank you very much, Paulina. And I think it cannot be stressed enough how important this point is about the particular issue of gender disinformation. And also, I understand you mentioned racism, and this is something to, I think we need to think and talk about much more and find solutions. Our next speaker, we're still staying online, is Jan Nicola Bayer, joining us from Vienna. Is that correct?
Yeah, thanks, Victor. Thanks for having me. Yes, I'm working for Democracy Reporting International. We are an independent NGO based in Berlin, and we are active in Europe, Asia, MENA, and Sub-Saharan Africa. We do democracy assistance in the wider scale from like citizen participation projects, rule of law projects, but we also have a unit that focuses on digital health of democracy. And as such, we have been warning of the technological developments for a long time. I want to synthesize maybe a little bit what my previous speakers have said. Like so far, we have focused predominantly on the cheap cost of producing this information. And I think it has been stated several times that with these new large language model, with generative AI, the cost has fallen. But also how in the initial moderation was said, the other thing that we need to focus on is the increased quality of disinformation products. And in particular, if we go away from ChatGPT and really focus on this text-to-image generation, then we really have a problem because we are slowly approaching a state where the human eye cannot differentiate anymore between what is fake and what is not fake. And I agree with Justin, one of my previous speakers, that yes, we are making also headway in terms of the technology that we can use in order to detect disinformation. What scares me, however, is the disbalanced investment when we look into the generation of artificial content, and then the investment that is given into the detection of such content. And that will be a decisive step when we have high quality synthetic content, that we will need to have tools and ways of differentiating what is authentic, what is organic content, and what is synthetic content. And if we don't develop these tools relatively quickly, we will have a problem in the future. And if we look at kind of like these investment imbalances, let's just remind ourselves, Microsoft has just invested 9 billion into the company OpenAI for developing the tools around ChatGPT. If we look at to the entire investment portfolio of the European Union, which only accumulates to 20 billion currently, or in the lower 20 billions, taking into account that only a tiny fraction of this amount is actually dedicated to maybe tools that are developed for the detection of synthetic AI, we see that yes, there is an arms race, but it's an arms race that is quite imbalanced. And I would pass it with that back to you, Victor.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah. So the good guys, so to say, are not winning this arms race. Now, Peggy. So cheaper, faster, better. What's not to like?
Well, thanks very much, Victor. It's such a pleasure to be with you all today and be able to come at this from the position of our office, which is the UN's Human Rights Office here in Geneva. We're engaged. You asked us to introduce ourselves a bit at the outset. We're engaged in this space quite significantly, looking at both ramifications for artificial intelligence for both governments and companies. And we've had references to the role of the big tech companies in this. And we have a project involving, which we call BTech, looking with the big tech companies at how they can implement their obligations under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And I'll probably say a few more words about that as we dig into the substance. But, you know, I think my fellow speakers have really set the stage for what we're facing here. I mean, I think you asked us to really think about what the implications are, what's not to like. And I think we really do. I totally agree with Aaron. There's, you know, to some extent, there's, you know, nothing new here. But at the same time, I think we have to be very careful. The implications are profound. And we're really only at the surface of what's going to be there. I mean, if you follow the tech press, you see every day a new rollout of a new tool. And many of those are by the big companies, but we also have to keep in mind it's also technology that, as Aaron has emphasized, it's a large language model. It's available in different senses for almost anybody to create tools in the space. So the reality is it won't just be the big companies that are active in the space in different ways, and that affects the environment in a variety of ways as well. But I also wanted to pick up the point that Justin made about the multiple sides of it. The reality is, yes, there are, you know, very, very substantial risks here. But we also have to look from a human rights perspective about some of the ways in which these technologies will help us to move human rights forward and achieve the SDGs. And I was listening to a podcast yesterday where they asked some of the writers, some of their listeners to write in about, like, how are you using it and is it useful for you? And really had some wonderful test case of how ChatGPT can actually make a real difference in people's lives, including, for example, use for people who are not who are working in English language environments but aren't native English speakers, or people who have to interpret medical records that they can't really understand, and need a quick look, not to replace a doctor but to use in other ways. So, you know, we need to recognize that there are good uses of this technology, but also to control for the risks. And that leads us to this point about the need for guardrails. the reality is this is not a new issue. We've needed guardrails around use of artificial intelligence for, a long time, and we have not been able to successfully put them in place yet. Let's be very clear about that. Our office, for example, has reported extensively on mass surveillance technologies, use of facial recognition in different contexts, and have called, for example, for moratoriums on use of certain tools in certain contexts when they have profound human rights implications and the guardrails aren't there. But the reality is we see, for example, facial recognition tools that have not been subject to such guardrails being deployed in law enforcement settings, which is a high risk setting, in contexts across the globe. So the reality is we're already not keeping up, and now we're faced with the impacts of generative AI that we've been talking about. So we really do have a problem on our hands, and we need to be able to respond. So I think in terms of, I know we'll get into the details of what the responses will look like, but to set the stage for that that question, I think we need to look at both, what does generative AI bring into the equation? I think the difference today, of course, is its commercial availability and multiple millions of users in different ways than before. But it's also this, what's been referred to as the arms race, the fact that now that ChatGPT is there and Bing Chat has come, now we have Bard, the exponential snowball effect of everyone wanting to be part of this and putting as many tools on the table as quickly as possible is a new level of challenge that we have to recognize. Two things that we need to think about as we go forward. One is what we don't know. The reality is one of the greatest obstacles to actually working in the space is the lack of transparency around both what the tools are, what data they're trained on, how they're being used. Bing Chat, for example, does give at least references to some of the information you get back, but other tools do not. We need to understand better all the information we don't have that will help us address this problem, and we need to find a way to increase transparency to make it work. And the other big challenge we have is something I've already referenced, is our metabolism. We just are not able to move quickly enough to address these issues. And that's a challenge for everybody in this room. And I think you're all people that are committed to these issues and looking at them. And what we need to do is find pathways that will allow us in the international environment to really help set these guardrails in a much quicker and faster paced way than I think many of our mechanisms currently allow. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peggy. So guardrails, transparency, and remember the metabolism, just some of the keywords I picked up from here. It is now time for us to address the issue of remedies, solutions. Remember, we are not just discussing what to do with AI. We want to address disinformation in general. And I would ask speakers, and again, Justin will start with you in a second. From the perspective of a society, a nation that understands disinformation, information manipulation is a problem. There are probably some policies that we have been talking about for a long time to address disinformation, and then you have this new element. So what's your recommendation? What is the toolbox to address disinformation in the age of AI? What are your top recommendations to deal with the challenge? Justin, let's start with you.
Thanks. So I think this is a very difficult question because we're still trying to understand the nature and the severity of the problem itself. So I think that this is not something that can be answered in one kind of sitting or one session. We're at the very early stages of defining what is possible and where this technology might go. And so my short answer to you is that we need to understand that this is going to be an ongoing conversation that is going to evolve alongside the technology and alongside how we see the technology being deployed. But I think there are two things that we need to learn from the earlier fights against disinformation and other online harms, for example, hate speech and other toxic content. And those things are firstly that as other speakers have said, we need to try and figure out how to put some guide rails in place. So both guide rails in terms of light touch legislation, and I say light touch because we need to learn from specifically the pandemic, where we need to understand that attempts to clamp down on harmful content can in itself be weaponized against free speech. So we need to be mindful about trying to develop guide rails that doesn't curtail free speech for organic kind of human or kind of legitimate other vehicles who want to communicate information. By vehicles, I mean media and other kinds of institutions. So that's the one thing. We need to get these guide rails in place. But we can also learn from the way that the social media platforms have tried to deal with disinformation and toxic content on their platforms. And that means that we need to hold the purveyors or the creators of this problem at least partially responsible for creating solutions. And the way that we've done that with mis and disinformation on social media is to say that this is a whole of society problem. We need a whole of society solution. And that means that firstly, we need funding and resources in place to fund some of this research that Jan flagged is lagging behind in terms of detection and countermeasures. And so companies or organizations that are building technologies to create synthetic media should be setting aside a percentage of their budgets and of their revenues to help create watchdogs and create tools that help everyone from expert researchers to everyday citizens understand the origin and the intent of the information that they're getting online. So firstly, we need resources that are put in place. We need access to the same training data that is being used to create these technologies. So AI isn't born clever out of a box. It trains itself on massive amounts of public information, whether it's large language models, whether it's large image banks and video banks, and researchers often cannot develop a countermeasure or an inoculation against the resulting technology if they don't have access to the same amounts of massive data to train their countermeasures on. So in addition to resources, we need access to data. And then we need to start thinking about some public principles that we put in place. And that ranges from whether tagging synthetic media is useful. And we see it has had an impact. We've seen scientific studies say that tagging the origin of state-affiliated media, for example, on social media, or fact-checked content on social media, does have impact on how people perceive that information and whether they want to reshare it or believe it. So in other words, we need to start labeling that, yes, I might look human, but I'm actually an avatar. And then you will perceive the message that I'm giving you in a slightly different way. So that's the one thing, is labeling. The second thing is that we need to also, in addition to just labeling whether I'm synthetic or not, we need to kind of explore whether it would be effective to also say who the actual author is behind a message or behind an avatar or behind a service that you're receiving, so that you understand who is behind and has an agenda for distributing a message. And this is often very good. It could be a health agency or ministry. It could be someone who has a for good mission, who is trying to do public education. Once you understand who is behind the messaging, it feeds into the way that we perceive the message and how we calibrate what we take away from that message. Other things I think that we should also consider includes ethical codes. So those two examples I gave of Burkina Faso and the Democratic Republic of Congo, we were able to figure out who was behind those video messages because the company involved had an ethical code that said that you could only use our services for the following kind of purposes. And both of those use cases violated the terms of reference. So we need to understand how we can provide some industry standard ethical guidelines for commercial services that are offering these technologies to a wider public. And that's especially important because for as little as $30, you can run a mass audience campaign on one of the available tools at the moment. And then the final thing is that these watchdogs that are being put in place, whether they are fact checkers or public media or human rights organizations, we need to put in place not just the tools that they can use to do their analysis and their research. We need to ensure that there's public funding for them to be able to operate at the same scale and the same speed as the creators of the content and the creators of the technologies.
Thank you very much, Justin. So resources, access to training, data, funding, we need principles, and also we need to ensure there is transparency, not just the message itself, we also need who is behind the message. Arian, that's a good place to start, right? Or rather to continue, I'm sorry.
Yes, definitely. So from Canada's perspective, we wholly believe in a whole of government and whole of society approach to this problem. And each stakeholder group has their own responsibilities and must do their part. For governments, that means respecting, protecting, and fulfilling human rights. And as Peggy alluded to, companies also have human rights obligations to fulfill. And for governments, this means we have to approach legislation and regulatory efforts with some caution. So far, the responses to disinformation, including legislation, have been misused to unduly restrict freedom of expression. Reporting from the Committee to Protect Journalists shows a steady increase in journalists who have been jailed over charges of fake news or disinformation over the past several years. So attempts to regulate AI facilitated disinformation have to be grounded in international law and be developed in an inclusive and transparent process. For Canada, we released a directive on automated decision-making by public actors. And this was done in consultation with multiple groups of stakeholders. And the principles underlying it relate to administrative law in terms of transparency, as well as procedural fairness, in that those who have had decision rendered by an algorithm have the right to seek human review of that decision. And again, I think, as I said previously, the more we can focus on principles and structures such as transparency and procedural fairness, and less on content, the more likely we are to still respect human rights in our responses. And I think it's also important for democratic governments to invest in democratic resilience against disinformation, such as civic education, as well as lifelong media and digital literacy, not just in terms of assessing information for accuracy, but we really need a broader understanding of how digital technologies are created, deployed, and used. And that helps us to contextualize information that we're assessing. And Canada has been working with Latvia and the Alliance for Securing Democracy in our Summit for Democracy cohort on information integrity. We spent the past year discussing best practices to strengthen the information ecosystem. And we consulted a diverse set of experts, some of whom are on this panel today, on how they assess the current situation and how we can continue to address gaps in responses to this information. And we hope to continue building on this work in the coming months. So greater international collaboration is needed to respond to information manipulation by malicious actors. And Canada and Netherlands have been working towards a high-level declaration on information integrity online. And we hope to reach out to partners to sign on in the coming months to really reinforce these high-level principles to protect information integrity in a rights-respecting way. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Arian, and thank you for mentioning the work of the cohort. And just one thing I want to add to this: the purpose of the cohort was to actually try and reach a broader a group of countries that are interested in working on information integrity. So basically sharing knowledge that already has been accumulated, and also work together in the future. We now go back online to Paulina. So from your perspective, what are the most important policies and tools against disinformation, taking into account the ascent of AI? And I need to ask the speakers to be really concise, perhaps within 3 minutes, because we are running short on time. Thank you.
Thank you. I will keep it under that. But first, let me thank Peggy for actually mentioning transparency, because that's one of the cornerstones of what we actually need. We don't know much about what's available within the social media platforms, but I can assure you, without any conspiracy theorism here, that they know everything, and we don't know even how they make decisions internally. So, but in order to protect information integrity and address AI-powered information manipulation, as the panel says, and to actually ensure open, free, safe, and secure online public space in Fundación Multitudes, we believe it is important to promote the co-regulation of the online space, in particular social media platforms, with a human rights approach. So I also like to thank Erin for bringing this up, because all industries are somehow regulated. Why are we not talking about regulating, especially in the global South, social media platforms? So the co-regulation is the mechanisms through which governments, civil society, and organizations, academia, and big tech companies promote and strengthen collaboration between them to establish measures aimed at protecting and promoting information integrity, considering the perspectives of all the actors involved with a preventive approach. And we actually lived through that, sort of speaking, with the exception of the participation of social media platforms in the cohorts that you, Victor, and Erin mentioned. That was a very good example of collaboration across the board. So it's important to implement this co-regulation mechanisms, including the participation of young people, considering that people aged 20 to 29 are the biggest users of social media. So co-regulation offers an alternative to self-regulation of tech companies, which is a voluntary process that does not provide the same guarantees as laws and regulatory resolutions, and tends to establish codes of conduct that do not match the needs of society, creating a real vacuum of transparency that is definitely the perfect ground from disinformation. So these mechanisms must be complemented with the application of a human rights approach. We're talking about AI, but we need that human rights approach to establish and protect equality, have a healthy public sphere, and ensure that public infrastructure is shaped and guided by democratic structures that can establish an adequate governance of the use of AI, machine learning algorithm. And it's true that AI, in particular regarding information manipulation, presents a threat to democracy, democratic resilience. However, it's also true that these algorithms do not understand, internalize, process requests before producing a response. They predict useful outcomes from the patterns and structures in enormous data sets, and therefore, the production of content purposely created to mislead can be prevented through the design of safeguard against the misuse of algorithms and the establishment of mechanisms to de-bias this data. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you very much, Paulina. And we go over to Jan. Now, Paulina mentioned regulation. The EU has been, I think, moving the fastest in that direction. Maybe, Jan, you can comment on that as well. But yeah, remedies and policies to address disinformation. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. Yeah, maybe to add a little bit to what the previous speakers said, that I think we need to change our mind about what these AI systems are, and like we need to really treat them as commercial products, because that's what they ultimately are. And with other commercial products, we would have product safety standards. You can't bring a machine onto the market before it's tested whether it catches fire. These machines are catching fire already, and we are not committing them to the same tests. So like, maybe one recommendation would be to keep such systems longer into a sandbox, like basically in a testing environment where we can actually evaluate their risks and their problems before they are let onto the market. This would be one thing. And attached to this is the point that I made before, that we need more investment into research, that also researchers have the capabilities of evaluating the risks that these technologies pose. The other thing is that I would say is kind of like, we need to go away from or we need to be quicker with learning positive or learning from positive examples. I mean, we have countries like Finland, for example, that is carrying education about disinformation into primary schools. I don't understand why Finland is still kind of an outlier with this kind of approach, that early childhood education starts with information about disinformation. And we need to be quicker with adopting such lessons. By the same way as we see private initiative, and this is referring to something that Justin already mentioned in terms of kind of the marking or the identification of synthetic content. We have provenance technology. There are initiatives like the content authenticity initiative, which try to develop kind of like standards by which we can induce kind of like little watermarks into synthetic content in order to recognize what is authentic, what is unauthentic. And governments need to be quick to adopt these, to push these words forward and make them at a certain point also mandatory for new models to adopt them, in order for new models to have them, because we will run this risk that at certain point we cannot differentiate anymore what is synthetic, what is authentic content. And finally, Victor, and this is maybe the point that you mentioned, I think that we need to have this awareness that these are cross-country problems, and we can't regulate them on a national level. I think the EU has made good progress at least as a supranational entity to try to regulate, to rein into some of these challenges. But I think there needs to be more a global approach to regulate these problems, because national states cannot do this alone.
Well, thank you very much, Jan. States cannot do it alone. Peggy, again, this is a perfect place for you to take over. You represent all of the countries.
Thanks. No, it's a big responsibility you've placed. No, I think many of the points I want to emphasize have been made by my fellow panelists, so I won't belabor them, given that I was actually going to time myself this time, the lack of time. This issue around transparency, I think, is absolutely fundamental, and that's my point about knowing what we don't know. The example that Justin gave about pandemic disinformation was very important. What we learned during the pandemic is that some of the approaches that we thought would work to address disinformation were actually counterproductive, and metabolized it in a way that metastasized it in a way that made it grow rather than reduced it. So part of how we find how to counter disinformation better is to understand better what is happening. And for that, we need transparency and access to the data that is now housed within the companies. That is, using open APIs and other techniques, and legislating for that to happen, as has been referenced. Some of that is being done within the Digital Services Act of the EU. The second point is, you won't be surprised to hear me say the importance of the human rights framework here. I take Justin's point about ethical frameworks and their usefulness, but the reality is ethics draw from and have been built upon in the human rights framework. And the advantage that we have with the human rights framework is that it is already agreed cross contexts, cross countries, cross regions, and it provides a very helpful way of looking at the challenges that we're currently facing, and will help us address these difficult issues of freedom of expression and regulatory overreach that Aaron very helpfully pointed out. So we need that human rights framework, but we need it to be implemented. And that goes to these issues of what are both governments and company responsibilities in the space and how do they move forward on them. And the crucial issue there is for them to do what we call human rights due diligence. There are ways to do a human rights impact assessment, to really look at, decide, work in a very cooperative way to look at what are the risks of the various technologies that are being put out, and then put in place techniques to mitigate and prevent those worst impacts. That is the type of work that needs to be done in a very serious way and needs to be resourced and happening. Our office is trying to do that with some of the big companies, with the idea that what happens in that space will really set the ceiling for what can happen in other places, because we know that smaller companies won't have the same resources to do some of that work that the bigger companies should and do. And then I wanted to pick up Paulina's point about what type of approach we need here. It's all well and good to say that we need, various companies to do this, but the reality is, because of some of those resource issues, we don't want it being done in a scattered way across all of these different places. We need a coordinated approach. We need for it not to be siloed. And I agree that co-regulation, which means that not each company comes up with its own standards, but that we have standards across the ecosystem, across the industry, and those standards are enforceable. The companies agree that they would be enforceable, or if not, we put in place mandatory techniques like the mandatory human rights due diligence that again is being considered within the EU. Just closing on the global approach, and maybe we can come back to it so I don't go too much over time. But the issue on the global side is that we do have some models that are being developed. We've referenced the European one here, but we need to make sure that we're really doing not a one size fits all. We need to look at what will work in different contexts, given the framework that exists there. And we need to provide support and help. And that's the global approach will not necessarily be a top-down approach. It will be, how do we actually provide support and technical assistance in different ways across different contexts, and come up with not one set of models, but multiple models that can be deployed and used by countries that are looking to do better in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. I think you actually already have engaged with the third question that we wanted to raise about what does it need, how does it impact the whole human rights agenda. I will still ask you to give more comments on that in a couple of minutes. And just one remark I also wanted to make here. When you say providing support and help, I think we have seen how a recent push for creating better regulations for platforms. It was quite interesting and important, but we also came to the conclusion that you cannot really create regulation that fits all countries, that there are so many other aspects, especially human rights safeguards, that you need to take into account when creating regulatory frameworks in each particular country. And here we are at this very important question. Justin mentioned the weaponization of fight against disinformation that's sometimes phrased, and the risk is obviously that attempts to deal with the threat of disinformation, either on purpose or by mistake, leads to more censorship and more limitations on freedom of expression. And just to remind, something that you here at the UN know very well, know by heart, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. And what I want to single out here, this right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information. We focus, I think, very much on the right to receive information. But what does the freedom to hold opinions without interference mean when there is a whole multi-billion industry pushing you to have a specific opinion? So how do you deal with that? We go to Justin back online. Justin, please.
I think that we need to understand that generative AI is not just a freedom of speech or a freedom of information issue. And I think that we need to be very nuanced in our approaches to try and when we try and mitigate that harm, because otherwise we are going to start straying into everything from freedom of even association and other kinds of human rights. We're going to start impacting on those rights. What we should also be aware of is that the problem of these generative AI tools are potentially going to be felt most severely ironically, in countries with the least access to online information and online assembly. So in marginalized communities or in communities that don't have internet access or don't have free and cheap and fast access to technologies that they can use to detect synthetic media or synthetic content. And so I think that the underlying principle here that we should try and use to guide any interventions is, how do we strengthen existing rights to have an opinion, even if it's a dissenting opinion, and to express that opinion and to use technology, whether it's in meta space, whether it's in kind of virtual worlds or in kind of real life, to assemble with others who might hold our own dissenting opinions. How do we entrench and strengthen those rights while simultaneously giving people the tools that they need to understand that when they are assembling or they are communicating, that they're communicating potentially with other human or other kind of legally recognized entities, whether they're organizations or other forms of legal entities, rather than dealing with an embodiment that might be a sock puppet for a malicious or a malign actor. I think it's a very challenging problem. And I don't think that it's something that we've dealt with before. Just to drill down on this fact, that one of the bigger threats is to people in geographies such as Africa, where I work and live extensively, is if you receive a piece of false information, if it's a video clip of a fictitious sock puppet, an avatar that looks human saying something, you receive it on a WhatsApp or another mobile device without any access to the internet to go and fact check and research whether that image that one of the other speakers referred to of the Pope wearing kind of fictitious fashion is real at all or not. You're going to take the synthetic media as legitimate, and you're not going to be able to debunk it as easily as someone who is fully plugged into the global internet. And so we also, I would suggest, need to prioritize some of these lower bandwidth countries and communities or marginalized communities for early and kind of extensive interventions and support. Thank you.
Justin, thank you very much. Very important point. Unfortunately, we are running terribly late here. So I would ask the next speakers to be really brief, but Erin, over to you.
Thanks, Victor. I just wanted to echo what you had said about the need to update how we uphold Article 19. So there is the right to access information without barrier or interference. But because of information manipulation, I think it's not just disseminating false information, and it's also just undermining trust in all information, and that has a huge impact on freedom of expression, and we really need to look at how we respond to that. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Erin. That was very good and very short as well. Thanks. Paulina, over to you for a very quick remark on this.
Sorry, I was having issues. Actually, I muted myself, but I just wanted to mention something, refer back to something that you mentioned in terms of opinion and freedom of speech. When we provide an opinion, when we try to share what we're thinking, I think that we don't make it with the intention of deceiving someone else. We don't make it with the intention of affecting democracy resilient, to impact or to open the door for authoritarianism. And I think that that's a huge difference. And And this is something that I always hear when I talk about regulating disinformation, but I want to go back to that and following the recommendations of the Council of Europe with the key principles to ensure, for example, transparency, justice and fairness, human responsibility for decisions, safety and security, and privacy and data protection. With that framework, governments should be able to support freedom, media freedom, and resistance to disinformation by promoting a diverse and independent media sector and ensuring media literacy at all levels of society. Also very much fundamental, human rights should be upheld on digital platforms by strengthening legal protections for free expression online, addressing digital threats to human security, enacting data protection and privacy laws to regulate access to and use of personal data. And in particularly, I'm sorry to be so strong about this point, but we must prioritize the co-regulation of social media platforms regarding data privacy and the bias of algorithms, which may include the entire revision of their business model. Products, as someone says, product and policies should have guidance from external expertise experience, particularly from marginalized and minority communities who experience the most abuse and more severe impacts from it. So the language emphasis by tech platforms on women, let me mention women, omits the experience of others targeted by gender-based violence, for example. So let's not gonna be scared about regulating. That will not actually affect freedom of speech and freedom of media, but on contrary, it will really support a much stronger media environment to combat disinformation.
Thank you very much, Paulina. Very important media freedom. Really important point. Jan, over to you. Please keep it very short. Unfortunately, we have to do it. But yes, over to you.
Yeah, maybe if just to add to points, like, I mean, much has already been said, but I think in order not to regulate content, which is, I think, the dangerous point when we start to limit freedom of expression, I think that the two things that we really need to look out for, and one thing has been mentioned, is kind of like that we push social media platforms for data on their recommender systems so we can audit them and we can make sure that they're not distributing inflammatory content. And the other thing is that we also push distribution networks, whether it's social media platforms and other tech companies, that they do not get the room to decrease their staff on content moderation and security measures, because we see it across the globe that these teams are cut back on all social media platforms, and this needs to stop. We can't let them do this.
Thank you very much, Jan. Very important point. So, Peggy, we're close to the end, and human rights, something that you work on a lot. It's over to you. And again, it's the UN context as well. Perhaps you can say something about that.
Thanks. No, just on the risks, I do want to point out that when we've tried to regulate in this space, we have often failed. And so, that overreach, the fact that we have people being arrested for a tweet, in prison for many years, these are real phenomenon that need to guide how we think about the space. So we're concerned about the rights that could be violated if we regulate in a way that's not effective. But I also want to emphasize the practical side, that if we don't get this right, we affect a lot of other rights, like the right to health, the right to employment. We need good information online to be able to make those rights move forward and to achieve the SDGs. And if we can't trust the content that's online, that's a real disservice to everybody across all rights. So what approaches do work? Aaron also pointed out that we need to look at the process. We shouldn't look so much at the content. We need to look at the actors and the behavior and regulate those things. And we need participation. We need an inclusive way of evaluating these regulations. When we bring in experts and civil society, we get better results. So we need to make sure to do that. I just want to pick up the 2 points made by Justin and Jan about the imbalance in the digital setting and the need for the companies to have stronger teams in place. Those are things that can be regulated. Let's be clear. We should be looking at what is the level of investment in different languages and different approaches. And we should be saying that you need, a certain level of investment in content moderation and safety teams and other things. And those are things that we should really emphasize. Finally, I do want to emphasize we can't solve disinformation only online. Disinformation is also happening in regular old media and in our environments more generally. So we always have to make sure that we do take on both environments. Thanks.
Excellent points, Peggy. Thank you very much. Now we have perhaps time for one question, if there is one. And I can see hand there. Switzerland, please go ahead, sir.
Good morning. Actually, it is not a question, but is an invitation to all governments that are interested to work with the Council of Europe on a global standard based on democracy, human rights, and rule of law standards, but also conducive to innovation, to work on a framework or a convention on AI. The negotiations have just started, but it's not too late for everybody to join. I happen to be the chair of this committee, so you can ask myself or my colleagues or other people from the Secretariat of the Council of Europe. Thank you very much.
Excellent advertisement. Thank you very much, sir. We can still take perhaps one quick question. If there are no pressing questions, I would probably want to ask Ambassador Hassans to say a couple of words.
Yes, thank you. I will be very, very short. And of course, the disinformation and internet literacy education is their utmost important topics in nowadays. But here in Geneva, we have 21 organizations, and we have dialogues with less developing countries, African countries, or other regions. And I would just mention or say or request one thing. And we already talked about the sustainable development goals, and our principle is, no one should be left behind. And what we are doing, how we are doing, we should keep in mind sharing with our technology, sharing with our knowledge with least developing countries as well, because they need basic needs. And when we have dialogue about cooperation in digitalization, and there are a lot of needs. And just my request is we should keep our mind and bilateral or multilateral based to help them and to assist them, and sharing with our knowledge and sharing what we have. And of course, it should go technology and education. They should go hand to hand. But we shouldn't forget as well this part of the world, especially least developing countries. Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bakhtiaris. Now we have to conclude, and I just want to say three things very quickly. First of all, this discussion has left me much more hopeful than I was before. Thank you for that, dear speakers. My second observation is that there is a very important role for the United Nations to play on this agenda, also perhaps through the Global Digital Compact that was mentioned here. And lastly, I think I would have loved to stay here and listen to you much more, which means this is a conversation that actually needs to be continued, and I hope we can do it at some point. So I would like to thank you, speakers, both you, Peggy, and you, Aaron, and also Paulina, Justin, and Jan. So I know some of you have joined us at an ungodly hour. Thank you very much. You're extremely sharp in the middle of the night. That only proves how great experts you are. And thank you, of course, to you, the audience. Without you, this event wouldn't have been interesting and relevant. Thank you very much for attending, listening to us here in the room and online. Thank you very much, and have an excellent day.